So you may consider at this point the reasons for which the proponents of these tax system changes may have put forward when trying to change the tax system. And one of the most popular or widespread is the Laffer Curve. If you haven't heard of it before, let me very briefly explain. The Laffer Curve is the idea that simply, well, at a tax rate of 0%, of course, the government will get zero tax revenue. But also we could say if the tax rate is 100%, well, we might also expect zero tax revenue, simply because no one will work. Now, this is a slightly kind of crazy thought experiment, if you like, because when you're at 100% tax rates, then what kind of system are you in? Is it still capitalism anymore? It's a bit of a strange question. And if you're not working, what are you doing? But the idea is at 100%, there's no tax revenue because no one wants to work. So let's just at least entertain it for now. And then you have some sort of, some sort of N-shaped function between those two rates, where there is some rate in between, which is the tax revenue maximizing rate of tax. Yeah, where it's not so high that it doesn't impinge upon people's wish or desire for work, but it's not so low that, well, yeah, it doesn't actually generate any revenue. So there's some sort of Goldilocks level in between. Now, this is at least the very broad concept. The first criticism of the Laffer curve is, well, how exactly are we meant to know if the curve is at its maximum here at 70% or at 50% or at 90% or 99%? Exactly how we're meant to understand the concavity, the curvature of the curve is really up in the air. And so this sort of theoretical concept can be used and abused to all sorts of ends without knowing exactly how to fit this curve, this largely abstract curve. That's one criticism. Well, the related claim that lower taxes boost economic activity, which is essentially what Arthur Laffer was saying when he was using this curve in order to convince or at least help Reagan introduce some of these tax system changes. The claim at the time was, well, if we lower the taxes, we'll actually boost economic activity and we'll even increase tax revenue by boosting economic activity. So GDP will increase, income levels will increase. We can refute this claim quite easily, or at least there is evidence to suggest that it's not quite true. Let's stick to the more careful formulation. Here we have the data on pre-tax income growth for all parts of the income distribution between 1946 and 1980, right? So this is an average for each part of the income distribution. And what we see is that between these years, these post-World War II decades, the average income growth was 2% in the US, and it seems most parts of society largely benefited at the same rates. Basically, all incomes were rising, except at the very top of the distribution where it was perhaps 1.2 or so. But still, everyone was doing better. If we now look at the same setup or same data for the post-1980 period, so today's period in some sense, we of course see this very unequal distribution as we'd expect. But perhaps what you would not expect is that the average income growth overall, so for all parts of the income distribution, is actually lower. So already we have some at least preliminary evidence that lower taxes do not boost economic activity, because this period was the period in which we had, as we saw, very high taxes, relatively speaking, and yet we had a high average income growth rate. But we also see with this distribution, not only is the average income growth lower, we see that the very bottom of the distribution has really not been benefiting in recent decades from changes to the sort of economic system. Not just the tax system, but the greater system, because this is pre-tax income growth. So there are real winners and losers from the system. Okay, so what we can take from this is, well, the period with less tax progressivity had lower overall growth of income. So we can already begin to refute the claim. But even if that were not the case, we could argue that perhaps setting a maximum income is desirable. So to return to the ideas of Roosevelt of banning excessive incomes, as was the very purpose of these quasi-confiscatory tax rates that he set of like 94%, which in today's income would be, if you had more than $1 million, the 1 millionth and first dollar would be subject to 94% tax rate. Yeah. So, but why? Might this be politically or economically desirable? Well, as Sayers and Zuckman state, I think, quite eloquently, and I'll just read it off. I normally try to avoid such long quotes, but I think this is perhaps a good one. As they state towards the end of their book, wealth is power. An extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power. The power to influence government policy, the power to stifle competition, the power to shape ideology. Together, they are the power to tilt the distribution of income to one's advantage, in the marketplace, in governments, in the media. This is, and has always been, the core reason why extreme wealth owned by some can reduce what remains for the rest of us. When in place, quasi-confiscatory tax rates redistribute economic power, equalize the distribution of pre-tax income, and make the marketplace more competitive. So essentially, they are arguing that if you have more fairness in the distribution of income and wealth, you can be ensured that there is more competition in the marketplace for various goods and services, but also that you're not using wealth simply to capture more power, perhaps through capturing more of the media or through regulatory capture, which is a phenomenon that we've seen rise over the decades. So they're essentially arguing that wealth inequality has a negative externality. If you're familiar with the economics jargon, a negative externality occurs when a transaction takes place that has effects on not just the people in that transaction. So for those people, the wealthiest trying to accumulate more wealth, it has this negative externality on the rest of society, which limits or reduces social welfare. And therefore, perhaps, even if the Laffer Curve did hold, which it doesn't, or it doesn't seem to, we may even, in that world, want to ban excessive incomes, or at least considering a very top level, maybe incomes above 5 million, 10 million, whatever you want to call it. It's a point to consider for sure. Another claim that we might want to discuss and perhaps dispel is the idea that tax avoidance is legal and thus impossible to rein in. This is claim number 2. Well, this actually goes against the one of the sort of core laws in the US called the economic substance doctrine, which is also to be found in other economies, in Europe in particular. And the economic substance doctrine basically says, well, any transaction that has no other purpose than a reduction of tax liability is illegal. So you can try to point out loopholes and say, well, actually, I'm acting in accordance with the letter of the law. But if you cannot justify that you would set up this shell company, for example, for no other reason than for trying to manipulate your taxes, then that is automatically illegal. So this is a myth that goes along with this sort of booming tax avoidance industry, but actually has no basis in, at least in relation to this economic substance doctrine, according to Sayers and Zuckman. So why, therefore, is tax avoidance so rampant? Well, the real difficulty is in enforcing this law. So essentially, since the 1980s, the funding of the Inland Revenue Service, or the tax collection agency of the United States, has not kept up with the booming tax avoidance industry. In fact, in the last decade alone, there's been a 20% cut in funding. So what we're seeing or at least what Sayers and Zuckman are proposing, is that this is part of a political choice, essentially. Not funding the IRS, or in some sense, choosing to leave that tax money untouched that they could have, that they could prosecute, this is a political decision. Because investigating all these cases, which may violate the economic substance doctrine, takes time, it takes money, it takes resources. So therefore, a political decision is needed, or was needed. But we have also seen counterexamples where action has been taken that has, in fact, reduced or had at least an effect, and a negative effect, on tax avoidance. So, for example, in 2010, Obama signed into law the Foreign Act Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA, which was essentially a 30% tax on all non-US financial institutions that do not cooperate with the IRS in providing details of those US citizens' foreign-held income. And well, at least according to Sayers and Zuckman, there's already some positive results from this legal change, whereby, say, banks and financial institutions in Switzerland and other fairly financially opaque, secret sort of havens have started cooperating to a much larger extent with the relevant American authorities. So again, it seems from this setup at least that tax avoidance is largely a political choice. It's not an absolute inevitability of the times that we live in. So just before we finish up and summarize, let's have a quick look at wealth inequality today in the US, or remind ourselves, because we looked at something similar last time. Here though, we have the top 1% and the bottom, I think 50%. I can't quite see my own slide, but I'm pretty sure it's bottom 50% of wealth owners in the US. And what we see as well, yes, of course, the top 1% own a remarkably large fraction, up to 40% in recent times, of all wealth in the US. But if you look at the bottom 50%, we see that, in fact, the liabilities have started to take over the assets. So for the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution, according to the data on the World Incomes database, we see that the bottom 50% now are in more debts than they have assets, especially after the financial crisis of 10 years ago. So this has a massive effect on social cohesion, on aspirations in the US for a large part of society. Here we're talking about 50% of people, so that's what, maybe 150 million people. And the very idea of the American dream is very much under threat, to put it lightly, from this kind of mass inequality. So what can we do about it? We've seen the developments that have enabled this sort of maldistribution to occur. What can be done? So that's where we'll finish up with our policy implications. Well, the first thing I would like to take from this lecture is the fact that inequality is not simply an inevitable byproduct of economic forces beyond our control. The literature, not just on the tax system, in fact, but the literature as a whole shows that institutions, that political choice has a massive impact on the distributions of income and wealth. We've seen in this lecture in particular that the US tax system as a whole is flat and regressive, in fact, at the very top. And this is contrary to the appearance of progressivity, and this tax system therefore allows for this growing inequality to take place unabated. The case of the US tax system, I would like to emphasize, also mirrors recent developments in major other economies. In particular, corporation taxes that have been sinking in the US have been falling faster in other countries. So I would like to come back to that next week in much more detail. We've seen that through changes in the tax system and decisions not to penalize tax avoidance. We see the political role, as I've already mentioned, in fact. But there is some good news. So we also see the policy implications. They are obvious and implementable as well. Generally, they are to reverse these sorts of capital bias tax cuts. But in more detail, perhaps it's time to consider a repeal to sales taxes on necessary goods that affect the poorest the most and are inherently regressive. And if we are going to have VAT and other kinds of sales taxes or consumption taxes, then we perhaps should include them on services that the richest to consume much more of. Similar policy implications would be, well, fully fund the IRS, ensure that they have enough resources to effectively combat these cases of avoidance and evasion. And this could be, in fact, a, let's say, financially neutral or fiscally neutral move, because you would be encouraging more tax revenue by your act of funding the IRS to a greater extent. There have been calls for a wealth tax. I'll spend a little bit of time on this on the very last slide, as it is quite increasingly popular policy recommendation. And a last policy implication that may want to be implemented would be to tax corporations based on where they sell and not where they are headquartered. We're going to get into this in a lot more detail next week, and exactly how it will be implemented and achieved, but that's the basic principle at least. Okay, so just to finish, a wealth tax, how could it work? Well, we can at least begin by taking a proposal that was issued only last year. Elizabeth Warren had one, Bernie Sanders had one, and since we're speaking about the US, why not? Why not take theirs as a basis? So Elizabeth Warren's, for example, was if you hold in wealth more than $50 million worth of wealth, then you are subject to a 2% tax on that wealth above 50 million. So for the 50 millionth and first dollar of wealth you own, you will pay 2 cents of tax. And if you own more than 1 billion in wealth, then above 1 billion in wealth, you will be subject to a 3% tax. Now, given the low percentages, this may seem like it may not bring in so much, but of course, we've also seen the the gross maldistribution of wealth in the US. And in fact, this can be extremely beneficial to tax revenues in the US, as well as, of course, a part of achieving a more equitable distribution. How would this, in fact, be implemented? Well, most wealth, according to Sayers and not Piketty, but Sayers and Zuckman, most wealth is public knowledge, since, well, share prices are public knowledge, and a lot of wealth is owned in the form of shares. In fact, 80% according to the authors. But what about that wealth which is not public knowledge? Oh, my formatting has kind of broken down here, but it's the last slide. So essentially, the argument from Sayers and Zuckman is as follows. If wealth is not public knowledge, if it's not a publicly traded company that some wealthy person owns, the IRS can essentially compare the privately held stock to a similar stock which is public, and therefore compare prices, or compare that privately held stock to the historical price of that privately held stock and adjust for things such as inflation and so on. And therefore you can derive some estimates, at least, of how much wealth this person owns, and therefore how much wealth tax this person owes. If this wealthy taxpayer disagrees with this estimate, Sayers and Zuckman say, well, give them the option to pay in the supposedly undervalued shares instead of cash. Why? Well, because if they really truly disagree that the shares aren't worth so much, then they should be happy to provide the shares instead of the cash. And therefore, both sides of the equation should at least in principle be happy if you have the option of being able to disagree with the estimates and therefore pay in what you would say is a different estimate. So this is just sort of a brief sort of overview of how a wealth tax could be implemented, how it could work. There is a lot to be ironed out, but there's clearly, given the role of the widening wealth gap, there's clearly a role for new ideas. And this is perhaps one of the most potentially effective. To understand, and this is the last point, how different tax reforms could work, there is this very interesting simulator here on this Tax Justice Now website, which is in fact linked to the book I've been mentioned today from Sayers and Zuckman, where you can see the current distribution here we have of income, pre-tax income, and you can change it according to different reform plans, perhaps of the Democratic candidates, or their own tax plan down here. We were talking about Elizabeth Warren, so let's perhaps try that one. And we see that, yeah, we're taxing wealth above 50 million and below 1 billion at 2%, and here above 1 billion at 6%, which is higher. So anyway, we see the various components and the effect it has on wealth distribution. So the very top rate of tax on the Warren's plan would have been, because it's not in the race anymore, unfortunately, I guess, a top rate of 86% and a bottom rate of around 27%. And you can check out the other ones. Or in fact, you can play around with it yourself and see what could bring the distribution into a more equitable range by looking at financial transaction taxes and different corporation taxes and estate taxes. And you can even add sort of behavioral parameters like how much people try to avoid paying taxes and so on. Okay. That's it for today's lesson. I will see you all tomorrow for our discussion. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. See you then. Bye for now.